Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I also want to thank the Real Facebook Oversight Board for hosting us. We are going to have what we think is an important discussion about the way that Facebook and other social media companies have willingly contributed to the undermining of democracies across the world. We also want to thank Maria Ressa, CEO and president of Rappler Inc. in the Philippines, and Rafał Pankowski, co-founder of Never Again Association in Poland, for joining us, and also thank them for their courage and being willing to share their experiences. Unfortunately, we had some folks who really wanted to be here today, but safety concerns prevented them from appearing. This is just another, it's just an illustration of the threats that activists face when taking on these issues. I'm going to talk a couple of minutes about the report, and then we'll hear from Maria and Rafał and Heidi. I'm not even sure if I introduced myself. I'm NIGDY WI¹CEJ, and Heidi Barrick and I are the co-founders of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. So our report that we just recently released, Democracies Under Threat, documents the ways in which Facebook and other social media companies have contributed to the decline of democracies by allowing world leaders like Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Wilders, Orban, Modi to abuse their platforms by promoting hateful and undemocratic positions. One thing that should be noted is that the leaders that we document in this report are, we profiled them, but they're just examples of what is happening in countries across the globe as social media allows extremist politicians to post unchecked. We have a slide here. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other companies have deliberately not enforced their own hate speech and fact-checking content policy when it comes to world leaders. When Trump became a candidate, they actually went so far as to codify this policy. It had always been happening, but they codified it. Even though Trump was spewing some of the most offensive things we'd ever heard from a politician. And so the combination of the social media companies declaring that it was okay for world leaders to say and do whatever they wanted, and honestly, extremists and far-right leaders across the globe learning from Trump and his social media tactics, we've had a devastating effect on democracies. About 25% of Trump's 6,000 posts in 2020 contained extremist rhetoric and misinformation about the coronavirus, the elections, and his critics. And this information was shared more than 927 million times. We say that to sort of give you a picture of how widespread this content goes on social media. A specific example is Bolsonaro out of Brazil. He regularly refuses to use traditional media and does his announcements and his speeches on Facebook Live, where once he was allowed to say that indigenous citizens in Brazil were still evolving and becoming human. Even after many pleas to take this down under the dehumanization policy, Facebook refused, emboldening other leaders. Trump and other world leaders do not have the right to this kind of megaphone to spread hateful and extremist rhetoric and undermine democracies. These companies have a responsibility to protect their users from hate speech, misinformation, and incitement to violence. There is no question that Trump's abuse of social media has emboldened world leaders and spurred the growth of authoritarian and far-right extremist activity and leading to real-world violence across the globe. Additionally, Facebook, not only do they allow these, and Twitter and YouTube, not only do they allow this content to proceed for world leaders, for political figures, but in a couple of cases, as you'll see in the report, they actually work directly with administration and campaigns of Duterte, Modi, and the AfD out of Germany to maximize their engagement tools and grow the huge audiences that support violent and undemocratic thinking. One thing we want to make clear is that authoritarian extremist leaders cannot grow their constituencies without spreading hateful and extremist rhetoric about and demonizing communities. It just can't happen. And Facebook and other social media, Twitter, YouTube, other social media companies are enabling this, and with devastating consequences. But here's the thing. It is only the extreme politicians who need these exceptions. The vast majority of global politicians are promoting human rights and inclusive democracies and have no need for this. And so why does Facebook and why do the other companies do it? Because this rhetoric is what gets the most engagement. It is what gets shared most often. And it is the source, the impetus for advertisement buys. So that's just a little brief overview of the report. We want to go to Maria now. And Maria, you have experienced horrific online harassment as a result of Facebook's policies, and have said that disinformation on Facebook is democracy's death by 1,000 cuts. Can you just share with us your thoughts on these issues?
I mean, first of all, Wendy and Heidi, thank you for doing this report. It's something that we lived through, so it seemed self-evident. Even the experiences that you've gone through in the United States also seems extremely clear. But to put it all together, I guess for me, so just 3 points for me. I think the first one is that the results that you have mirror the results of a study that was released last March by Julie Passetti at the International Center for Journalists. She and her colleagues went through, along with Rappler, almost 500,000 social media posts that were targeting me. So this was weirdly personal. And 60% of the attacks focused on credibility, right? Tearing me down, calling me a liar. 40% were sexist, misogynistic, very, very personal. But the reason it's interesting is it came to the same conclusion. It's a conclusion that Julie Passetti says she's found in a, and it will be part of a UNESCO study that will be released for World Press Freedom Day. So you're not alone. That's the first. The second one is the attacks that I went through. It does two things. When you're being repeatedly attacked, first of all, we all know that on social media, the fundamental flaw in our information ecosystem today is that on social media, a lie told 1,000,000 times becomes a fact. And lies and facts are treated equally, right? So this tears apart the old gatekeeping power of journalism. When tech took over, it essentially abdicated responsibility for greater engagement and money. Well, those attacks were meant to silence me and Rappler, the company that I lead. But at the same time, it creates this astroturf effect, a bandwagon effect, right? So it makes it seem like there's consensus. That's kind of a little bit of the foundation. And then what we've seen happen in the Philippines is that the third part, meta narratives, are seeded, repeated 1,000,000 times. So these meta narratives, even though they don't go viral immediately, take on a new life. So in my case, in 2016, what was seeded is journalist equals criminal. 2016, you say that 1,000,000 times, you pound it 1,000,000 times on social media, people believe it. And then what does social media do in 2017? President Duterte repeats it top down in his State of the Nation address. In 2018, the government files 11 cases against us. In 2019, I get my arrest warrants. So there are 8 arrest warrants in 2019. I get arrested. I post bail 8 times. And then in 2020, I get convicted for a crime, cyber libel, for a story we published 8 years later when the crime we supposedly committed didn't even exist, right? So 2021, I get more arrest warrants. So I could go to jail for the rest of my life for being a journalist. I guess the reason I'm saying that is that same methodology, the meta narrative, is exactly what you went through in the United States. This is from the Election Integrity Partnership. The meta narrative of election fraud was seeded on RT, on social media in August 2019, picked up by Steve Bannon on YouTube, seeded in closed Facebook pages. In August 2020, Tucker Carlson picks it up, mainstreams it. In October 2020, QAnon drops it. And then after that, President Trump comes top down. So this is insidious. It is what makes social media what a behavior modification system, and something that I hope will be curtailed so that I don't have to go to jail for the rest of my life.
Yeah, we hope so. We definitely hope so. Thank you for that, Maria. Rafał Pankowski, Rafał, you've been fighting anti-racism and dealing with the consequences of a growing illiberal government in Poland. Can you tell us your experiences when it comes to social media and how it's enabling your leaders?
Sorry, unmute.
Oh, you're on mute.
I apologize. I'll start again by saying thank you for having me. And I want to say that in the last years, the Never Again Association has documented a big rise in both hate speech levels and hate crime attacks in Poland. And in this context, well, Never Again itself has been an object of attacks from the same corners. But let me tell you about something that happened just several days ago when the Polish president addressed the diplomatic community, all of the ambassadors of all of the countries represented in Poland. And guess what he chose as his focus? Was it climate change? Was it respect for minorities? No, he chose to focus on what he calls the threat of quote unquote censorship by international companies on the internet. And he said he's in favor of, I quote, unlimited freedom of expression online. And why is that? Of course, very obviously, he is still thinking about his political friend, Donald Trump. But also, Duda himself is one of the big culprits when it comes to the discussion about hate speech, as mentioned in the report we are discussing today. So just last year during the presidential campaign, Duda talked about the LGBT community and about the Jewish community in ways that were deeply offensive. And he, for example, said, LGBT are not people. It is an ideology. This is the precise quotation. And if this is not dehumanizing, then I don't know what could be called dehumanization. And of course, these kind of messages are amplified by social media. And I am that hate speech works because it pays off, and he was re-elected. So I think it is, of course, one of many examples globally, but I think Poland, in a way, is important here because for years Poland was referred to as a model example of democratic transformation, and as we know, Poland today is also going through a serious crisis of democratic culture and democratic values, and definitely the role of social media is very important when it comes to this kind of crisis.
Thank you, Rafał. Just so that everybody knows, we're going to have a question and answer session. Heidi, if you don't mind, if you would just recap our demands or our key recommendations from the report, and also the Facebook Oversight Board, which Facebook says that they will abide by their decisions, has said that they will take up the issue of world leaders. And this is in addition to the Trump decision that's pending. Give us your thoughts on how or if that will happen.
Hi, everyone. And I just want to thank myself, Rafal, and Maria for the thoughtful comments. You know, when it comes to the Oversight Board, I'm incredibly skeptical about what's going to happen here. You know, to some extent, it's bought and paid for by Facebook, regardless of the fact that it claims to be independent. And I think it's a sloughing off of responsibilities from Facebook to make the decision that they should have made a long time ago, which is to apply their policies globally to everyone, right? Not to make carve-outs for speech for the exact people who are the most dangerous, which are political leaders who build their constituents here, motivate people, and inject societies with various forms of bigotry and hatred. And I'm also, you know, a little bit put out by the fact that this group of people who weren't elected, weren't put into office in some way, are going to make a decision that is going to impact, you know, more than 3 billion people that are on Facebook, and then all the spillage off the site, the WhatsApp, and et cetera. It seems almost an outrageous thing for that decision to be put in the hands of a group of folks like that. And that's not to say anything bad about them, but, you know, basically the question becomes who put you in charge, right? And I think that's really scary because it will, whatever the decision is, it will be seen as though, like it's the Supreme Court or something, like this was the right decision. And I think that, you know, the damage is quite serious that could occur here. You know, and I don't think we should ever forget either that these carve-outs were created by Facebook for Donald Trump. This is 2015. This is far before he was even president. And it started with his first post about a Muslim ban. The Facebook staff wanted it gone, and Mark Zuckerberg decided to keep it up. And from that decision, you know, 6 years ago, we have now got metastasizing hate and illiberal democracies in multiple places. And leaders, people like Modi and others are, you know, literally running campaigns that are resulting in real world violence offline. It's a really scary thing. And I'm not sure that this oversight board is the ones to decide how we should all live and what kind of violence, you know, we should face. I'm just going to recap the recommendations that we had in the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism's report. What we're specifically, you know, asking for is that any newsworthiness or political commentary exceptions that are given to political leaders, political parties, be ended. Policies are just applied globally to everybody. Fact-checking standards need to be applied to political advertising. I mean, why give these people who are, you know, using Facebook to demonize populations, make them the ones who have all this power to be able to avoid fact-checking? The company, all social media companies, Facebook in particular, need to design and implement genocide protocols, prevention protocols. We've already had one genocide in Myanmar that was orchestrated off Facebook. This is of the utmost importance. AI systems need to be created so that the pursuit of engagement does not favor hate content, conspiracies, polarization, disinformation, and there shouldn't be any monetization of this kind of information. And we want Facebook to conduct human and civil rights audits everywhere the platform is available. And they should be doing this in particular before they start engaging in political campaigns. It's the least they could do to protect people in multiple countries. So I'll give it back to you, Wendy.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. As you can see from all of the perspectives that we've heard from today, we're joining Real Facebook Oversight Board and a number of organizations in adding to our demands. First is we do not put Donald Trump back on Facebook. He cannot be trusted to do what is right. These companies need to publish a transparency policy outlining how a user's account is banned, because it is a completely opaque situation at this point. And then once those policies are published, we need to apply them, review all the world leaders in terms of those policies. And we want to thank the number of organizations that have signed on to these demands today, like Accountable Tech, obviously the Rappler and Never Again Association, ADL, National Hispanic Media Coalition, and a number of others. You can see it in the link to the letter is in the chat. So we want to now open it up for questions. And I want to also mention again that unfortunately we had hoped to have somebody from India on the call today, but safety concerns were paramount. If you have questions about India, Heidi and I can answer them, or any other subject or any other country in the report. But so Kyle, do we have a question? Do we want to get started?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and ask a first question to the panel, and if press can want to message me directly with if they have a question, we can queue them up and let you ask it, or I can ask it for you. So that, that's just a direct message to Kyle Taylor in the chat. Okay.
Well, I have a question for both Maria and Rafal. I'll start with Maria. You know, this sort of nightmare started when you documented how Duterte had manipulated Facebook. Can you just talk a little bit about what you found and why it was such a threat to his administration to document this? Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. This was in 2016. Yeah. You know, in 2016. So if you think about the kind of dominoes falling, Duterte's election was May 2016. Brexit was a month later. Then you had the Catalonia, you had President Trump. 2016 was when the world felt it, right? I would say that a lot of these policies, the first time we kind of saw the alternate realities was 2014 in the Ukraine, right? Here, Rappler was born on social media. We were born on Facebook. If Facebook had better search, we may not have put our own website. We remain a Facebook fact-checking partner. Doing fact checks is a game of whack-a-mole unless you look at the networks. That's what we do. So in 2016, we began to look at the information ecosystem. The Philippines, by the way, for the 6th year in a row, Filipinos spend the most time on social media globally. This is Hootsuite and We Are Social. So in 2016, we began to see the kind of hate to pound people to silence. So in August, we did a hashtag No Place for Hate campaign, naively thinking that this was just people being mean. Well, we were so naive. These are information operations meant to take power, meant to shift the way people look at democracy, the way democracy works. What we found, one, that 23 fake accounts can influence up to 3 million others. We found 23 accounts, we proved they were fake, and then manually counted the other accounts that they were touching. The second thing we found was a concerted government effort, pro-Duterte bloggers, and as over time, we've now shown both police, military accounts. Facebook has taken down last September influence operations, information operations linked to the Philippine police and the military. There are groups in the government that are actively attacking. So we proved that this was calibrated, that the lies are directed and targeted towards journalists, human rights activists. Women were targeted at least 10 times more than men. And we have data to prove all of that. The last twist is when the pandemic lockdown happened a year ago, the Philippine government, right around the same time that Hong Kong came out with the security law, we have our anti-terror law. This anti-terror law allows the government to arrest anyone they name a terrorist without a warrant and hold them for up to 24 days. There are 37 petitions at the Supreme Court. There are information operations now linked to the police and the Philippine military that are aimed to name human rights activists, journalists as terrorists. And there is an anti-terror law. It becomes exponentially more dangerous what's happening in the virtual world has a real world component. And I guess this is why as early as November of 2016, I really started saying this is alarming. What is our dystopian present is your dystopian future. And I think we saw it play out on January 6th.
I completely agree. And now Duterte is saying, if Facebook, I mean, he's basically threatening Facebook, saying, if you take away my giant platform, what good are you? We will get rid of you. Rafal, the question I wanted to ask you is specifically about how quickly your Ministry of Justice introduced that legislation that you mentioned earlier to prevent social media companies from taking down content that was not contrary to Polish law, which we have to acknowledge is not the most inclusive of set of laws. So do you believe that Duda and the other leaders in the government are threatened by losing their platform?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this proposal was made directly in the context of deplatforming Trump and the kind of anxiety that arose among some of those Polish leaders who used similar extreme language. So I think that there is no coincidence here. Well, let me mention that Poland actually has quite strict laws against hate speech, but those laws are very seldom enforced. And I think what is important here is that this legislative initiative is actually trying to do something to block or prevent Facebook and other social media companies from removing hate speech from the platforms, which is very paradoxical, because normally we would maybe expect a democratic government to put pressure on such companies in order to decrease hate speech levels. In this case, it is the opposite. But whether or not this legislation will be passed in Poland is maybe not so very important on a global level, but of course it could set an example to other nationalist and authoritarian governments. Let's say in places like Myanmar, where hate speech has led to genocidal actions against the Rohingya and against other ethnic groups in very recent past, of course. So I think it is quite dangerous, not just in the Polish case. But what I think I might mention here is also that Facebook already agreed to a very special and unique arrangement with the Polish government to provide an extra level of appeal for hate speech actors. If your hateful profile was taken down, you can address the Polish government, and the Polish government will address Facebook on your behalf, hoping that that your page could be brought back. And as far as I know, this kind of system, this kind of arrangement only exists in Poland. And Poland is currently the only country where Facebook actually gave in to this kind of political pressure in order to construct a special safeguard, safeguarding the hate speech channels to exist. So I think in a way, Poland is an interesting country. It is a kind of experiment we are facing. Thinking about how far those big companies can go in finding agreement and accommodating demands from authorities that are influenced by far-right ideology.
I think that's a really important point, and it just goes to, it's just another example of how Facebook has been willing to work directly with governments to the detriment of its citizens, like India, like the Philippines, and Poland. All right, I see we have a question. Kyle?
Yes, I have a few questions now in the queue, which is great. The first one comes from David Brennan from Newsweek. David wants to know, are the panelists worried that as COVID lockdown lifts in the US, we might see a spike in real world violence from far-right actors who've been radicalized online in the past year?
I think the answer to that is yes. There is the very real concern that we're going to see additional violence. I don't think that the January 6th was the end of it. And the sort of the seething anger that is permeating some factions of our society, as sad as it is, I can only see that it manifests in violence. Heidi, do you want to add to that?
I think that's right. You know, a lot of people have been radicalized into pretty terrible ideas, white supremacy, other forms of hatred. The lockdowns contributed to that. Plus, you know, the anti-lockdown protests fomented by Trump, the delegitimization of our election. We saw the rage on January 6th, and we'd already had a lot of domestic terrorism here in the United States targeting Jews, immigrants, others. I mean, that's not unique to the United States. It's happening in many places. So we're nowhere near seeing the end of this problem.
Next question. The next question is from John Pfeffer from the Institute for Policy Studies. And John asks, what kind of social media oversight mechanisms do you propose at the international level? For instance, does the Christchurch process offer a useful platform? That's for the full panel.
I mean, I'll jump in first and say, you know, November last year, there was a whole group of us under the Forum on Information and Democracy, an infodemic working group. I co-chaired it along with former EU Parliament member Maritka Schaake. She's at Stanford now. Whole, like a few months going through how do we find systemic solutions to this? Because the reality is all of the studies, all the research has proven that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further on social media, right? So think about it like this. If the very same platform that delivers the news, the facts, the world's largest distributor of news is Facebook, if that prioritizes the spread of lies over facts, then the platform is biased against facts. It is biased against journalists. Without those facts, how then can you have a shared reality? How can you solve any problems? Let alone how can you have democracy? Right? So this is a thinking fast platform, an emotional platform, social media in general. So the problem that brings up is once you have fragmented and you've agitated all of that, what happens to the people who have been, I guess the best way, let me phrase it this way, as we're fighting COVID in the physical world, in the virtual world, in our information ecosystem, we are fighting a virus of lies. It is also infecting people. It is, there are information operations where those virus of lies are released into the ecosystem for power. And when that happens, the people who get infected, there's a contagion effect, their perception of reality changes and they become impervious to facts. That's the task of the journalists today that becomes so much more difficult. How do you solve it? Well, take a look. I'm already at a point in 2016. If you asked me as a Facebook partner, I said, you know, I appealed for enlightened self-interest. I had more faith that social media platforms would do it, would act like journalists. I was wrong. And now we're looking at those legislative solutions. In the EU, the Democracy Action Plan, there are drafts of laws, the Digital Services Act, the Market Services Act, the UK Online Harms Bill. And then I want to see what happens in the US. You guys tell us, what about Section 230?
Was that a question? I think, yeah, I think Section 230, I mean, obviously it is at the heart of these issues, but I struggle to believe that there's going to be any meaningful reform soon. And so I think we're going to be left with trying to persuade / force these companies to, at a minimum, be transparent about their policies and actually enforcing them. I think that if they were to take the time to actually enforce what they have on the books, that it would go a long way toward making improvements. I think also that these companies, for the most part, are American, and they have a responsibility not only to the American citizens, but to the global citizenry. And that is something that has to be driven home. I don't know. I mean, we will see what happens with legislation at all the different bodies, but ultimately the responsibility lies with the companies. Kyle?
Did anyone else want to add any more to that question? Rafał, go ahead.
If I may just briefly echo what Wendy just said, I completely agree with you. I think, there is always room for some new ideas, but maybe what we need most just now is not so much brilliant ideas about global governance of the internet, which may happen at some point in future, but what is really needed and important now is to enforce the existing regulations that those and commitments that those companies already made. The code of conduct on the level of the European Union that Facebook and Twitter and other companies already committed to a few years ago, and the community standards which they produced themselves. If you read them, they are good. They make a lot of sense. Is not the lack of those commitments and those standards, but the problem is the lack of enforcement. And from our experience as Never Again Association, we have reported hundreds of hateful posts on Facebook and Twitter, including physical threats, including calls for genocide, calls for extermination, and in the vast majority of cases we didn't even get an answer, not to mention a decision. So I think that the biggest problem is once again implementing the existing commitments.
I think that's right, and it is another illustration of how these social media companies have what they purport to be global rules, but they do not have the language and cultural competency to even address them. Heidi, do you want to add to that, this last question?
No, I think Rafał and Maria and you put it well. I think that is the landscape. Wendy, Section 230 maybe gets a few tweaks. And so it's forcing the companies to fulfill their obligations, and that's going to take work by civil society and many people to make that happen. Or, maybe we get lucky and one of these days this leadership actually stands up for what's right. That's certainly not been the case so far.
All right, last question is, if nothing is done to rein in big tech, where are we in 5 years?
That's just a depressing question to have to answer. It's almost hard to imagine that could be the case. I mean, look, this is going to be a downward spiral. It's going to get worse in so many places. And the terrible things we've seen, already up to and including genocide. They're going to spread and infect and destroy more democracies, make the world a more illiberal place. It's going to make it much more dangerous for journalists. It's already become so dangerous. Maria already talked about, especially for women in that field. And our polarization will get worse because that drives engagement. I just don't think that that's an acceptable outcome to what we've seen. It already took too long for these companies to realize that they were a problem, and for the rest of us to demand that they change. And this can't stand.
I want to add to, the micro, macro, right? Micro is in the Philippines. We have presidential elections next year, May 2022. Duterte can only run for 1 6-year term, but it looks like his daughter, Sarah, will be running, right? So this year, going into next year, we're looking at the edge of the cliff. If nothing significant is done to protect facts, to protect truth tellers, then we're moving into, then we could lose our democracy. And worse, it would be by a vote, because the way democracy crumbles is digital authoritarianism, populism. They are elected. Social media gives them more power to do that. Once they're elected, they take the levers of democracy and crumble it in from within. That's what we've seen in Turkey, in Hungary, there's a whole list of countries in that. So for us, we're fighting for our democracy on the 35th year of the anniversary of the People Power Revolt that actually in 1986 sparked people power movements around the world, right? So this is when I began my reporting career at the pendulum of movement away from authoritarian one-man rule to democracy. So now that shift. I think the second thing is, good God, I hope it doesn't mean personally for us, for me at least, I am fighting these cases in court. But what happens with social media will have an impact on all of this. It seems far. And then the last part is, please don't forget geopolitical power play. It almost feels like Americans would like to think that this is happening, that the manipulation, the behavior modification system of social media is happening everywhere, but in Western democracies, as you can see, it is happening there. And I'll tell you my own personal experience with geopolitical power play. In September, Facebook took down Chinese influence operations that were targeting the US elections. They were creating fake accounts for that. They were targeting the Philippines. They were campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte for the upcoming elections. And they were attacking me. I'm a small journalist, one. So why? Then the other part of, so that's China, Russia, the connection to Russian disinformation. After the Senate released the data, the US Senate released that data, we were able to find the link between Philippines disinformation networks to the alt-right in Canada, to the IRA, to the Internet Research Agency, based on that. This is a global network. I think that's what the report is saying. There is formal power, and then there is this network of a nervous system that is shifting, manipulating the way we think and making all our democracies weaker.
That's really well said, Maria. Thank you. Rafał, do you want to add a minute to what you think it'll be like in 5 years?
Well, I would like to say something about a threat that is maybe more immediate. Maria mentioned the virus, and of course the metaphor is quite appropriate. But I think in many cases it is more than a metaphor, because many of the same extremist groups are spreading hatred and disinformation about the pandemic. And I think it is also important to mention they are creating a very real threat to people's lives through that. Well, in terms of our hope for for the future, I would like to say that, you know, currently we have two projects related to this subject. One is called Get the Trolls Out, which is about monitoring and analyzing the problem of hate speech. The other one is called Open Code for Hate-Free Communication. And I think the idea of hate-free communication is a great idea that we aspire to, and hopefully we will get there at some point. Whether it's in 5 years' time, I don't know, but we should try.
I think that's exactly right. Thank you, Rafał. That's a wonderful point. Thanks for your good work. So I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank Maria Ressa of the Rappler and Rafał Pankowski of Never Again Association. I'm NIGDY WI¹CEJ, and Heidi Byrick and I are co-founders of Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. And we really appreciate everybody coming and talking with us today. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you.